Hello, in this video we're going to go over the CSS units of measurement. And while there are about a dozen of them, and they might be very confusing, there's really only 4 of them that you have to be familiar with, that you have to really understand, and that you will typically use in your web work. So it's important to understand that only one of these 4 is absolute or fixed, and that is px, standing for pixels, which is the only absolute measurement that we will use because things like points and inches and centimeters do not apply to screens and computers. Only pixels make sense as an absolute measurement. The other 3 units are all relative: percents, ems, and rems, and we will talk about them each in turn. So if we look at the CSS for this document, we will see that at the top I have an HTML element selector, and I have the font size specified as 100%. It's not really necessary, but you'll often see it in professional CSS. But what does that 100% mean? Well, the default size for regular text in any web browser is 16 pixels. So if you put 16 pixels instead of 100%, you'd be doing exactly the same thing. This line, this CSS declaration here, it would have exactly the same effect in every modern browser as 100%. But the important thing to realize is that this is the root of the document, and the font size of the root determines all the other font sizes for everything in your document. So the browser will have given default font sizes to things like the headings, H1, H2, H3, to things like the LI element, the DT and DD elements of lists. Divs will generally inherit. Paragraphs will be this 16 pixel or 100% size unless you change them. These measurements don't only apply to fonts. They also apply to the width of any element you put a width on, or the height of any element you put a height on. They apply to padding and border. We use these measurements for everything, but the relative measurements are decided by this default font size. So if you say 1em, you're talking about the width of a capital letter M in the default font size. So that would actually be a width of 16 pixels if nothing else was affecting it. So the M is relative to what it's inside, what it's contained in, the element. So if it's inside a div with a bigger font size, then the width of that M is going to be different. So that's what my first 2 examples are illustrating. I have written an H2 heading that has a font size on it of 4em. The 4em is based on the default font size, so 4 times 16 if it's the default, but then the 2 M's that I'm indenting this H2, those 2 M's are based on the size of a capital letter M in this new font size for the H2. So you can see that this H2 is indented really a lot, whereas the paragraph below it, it is 1.5 times the default font size, and so its indent to the left of the word this is based on that new size. So it's, instead of being 2 times 16, it's actually 1.5 times 2 times 16. Let's look at the CSS for this. So the H2 that we're looking at, it's got a pretty simple pair of declarations on it. I increase the size, I make a new size based on the default. so that now my H2 is going to be the size of 4 times the default, whatever the default is. But my margin left size is based on that new font size. Similarly, my indented P, completely separated from and unaffected by the H2 above it, it's its own element, it has a font size of 1.5 times the norm, the default, but then its margin is determined based on that new font size. So M's are great to work with, but you have to understand how they change depending on the element that they're being applied to. Okay, now let's look at another example using M, one of our relative units of measurement. And what I'm going to show you is a div. All the divs on this page have a font size applied to them of 1.5 em. So every div will have the font 1.5 times the actual default size. So if you've got a P element, a paragraph element inside a div, the font size is going to be affected by that change in font size that's on the div element in the CSS. So that's what you see down here. This is a div that has a paragraph font that is big like this one, right? Same. I have a special paragraph class that also has a font size of 1.5 on it. And it is one you've seen before. The class is indented P, right? So it's got a font size of 1.5 em, and the div has a font size of 1.5 em. So what happens if I've got a div that has, of course it's a div, so it's got the 1.5 font size coming in from the div itself, and then inside it I put a P that also has 1.5 em as its font size. So 1.5 and 1.5, are you doing the math here? Because what you're going to get is this here, right? So this is that class that was applied here, applied on a div, and instead of being the font size that you see here and here, instead it is doubled, because font size 1.5 em plus font size 1.5 em actually results in 3 ems. So you've got double the size that you might have expected. This is not a problem if you understand how ems work, but it is a problem if you don't. Okay, finally, let's make a comparison of ems, rems, and percent. And I'm going to do that with this little brown div at the bottom of my page. That div has a class on it of div2. So right now it has a width of 50%. Not em, not rem, not pix. 50%. So that you can see how 50% works, 50% changes depending on the width of the browser window. And this includes how is it going to look on mobile. If this were on a phone, that 50% would get pretty darn skinny. And you might not really want something looking like that on somebody's phone screen. So you would have to change that with CSS for people using phones. But percentage, just so you know, it's a relative measurement. It's very flexible. It changes depending on the size of the browser window. If I were to make it, say, 30%, right, you can guess what would happen. Right? It's even narrower. So it might look great when you're on a wide window, but it might look terrible as the window gets narrower. So percents are completely relative to the size of the browser window or the device that you're on. So if the phone screen has a width of only 300 pixels, then 30% would be 30% of that. So what if we change this to 3 ems? How wide will that be? Ooh, really narrow. What about 30 ems? Much wider. Does that change with the browser window? No. 30 ems, it is relative to the font size, as you've seen before, but it's not relative to the width of the browser window. Percent is relative to the width of the device or the browser window. M is not. M is relative to the font size, which you've seen can come and go. Now, all divs on this page have a font size of 1.5 em. So that means that this div, the brown div we've been looking at, it is based on the root, which is HTML, and it is 1.5 times bigger than that root. So this M that we're using right now here, this 30 ems, it is based on not the root, it is based on what is the font size applied to divs, 1.5. So if I were to change the 1.5, then the width of this div would be different. And so, for example, what if I just make a simple change and I make it 2, and I save, I go over here, and now I'm going to reload. The width of that div becomes different because it's based on that font size. Let's put that back, 1.5, back to what we were, because we've been using the 1.5, because the one thing we haven't talked about yet is rem. Like an M, it is based on the width of the capital letter M in the default font, but it does not change. Rem does not change based on font size changes within the element. When you use a rem, it is always based on this measurement, the root of the document, and not on anything that's added later to one of the other elements. So if in our div 2, I make this 30, let's make sure that we've got it. Okay, so this is 30 ems. What would be 30 rems with an R, relative M? Come over here and reload. It is about 50% smaller because font size in all divs on this page are 1.5 em. I should change what it says right now. So this is why rem has become more and more popular, but it's not perfect for everything, right? What if we changed this padding to rem? Padding changes. What if we change all of our ems to rems? I've now changed every em measurement in my CSS to a rem. Let's reload and see what happens. It has made a number of changes to the way that my page is designed, and in particular, where we started with this indent and this indent, they used to be different, and now they are the same. Why? Because rem. So I changed my H2 margin to a rem, and my indent P to a rem, and as a result, those two indents are now identical, where before the H2 one used to be a lot bigger. You've only got 4 units of measurement to learn for CSS. You should learn them by heart, experiment with them, and master them so that you can use them correctly.